January 1945, Camp Florence, Arizona. The convoy of buses stopped inside the inner fence just after dawn, when the desert air was still cold and the creosote smell clung to everything. And among the hundreds of prisoners were a handful of women in grey field uniforms with Red Cross armbands who had been captured with German medical detachments in Italy months earlier and shipped across the Atlantic with other prisoners of war, now stepping into an American prisoner camp whose infirmary would show them a way of practicing medicine that felt an era ahead of what they had left. They were nurses trained to improvise with dwindling sulfur drugs and boiled instruments, used to stretch bandages and reuse glass syringes. And their first hour in the camp infirmary was a shock of stainless steel and order, an admitting desk with pre-printed triage cards, a glass-fronted cabinet stocked with sealed ampules of plasma, a compact X-ray machine mounted on a wheeled stand, and a clipboard posted by the door that mapped the station's day and time blocks of 20 minutes, as if injury could be persuaded to keep to a schedule. The thesis of this story is simple and operational. The United States had industrialized frontline medicine by 1944, and when captured German nurses encountered penicillin, standardized plasma transfusions, and portable radiography inside an American system scaled to armies, they saw survival curves change in front of them. Two hard anchors defined the scale of that change. By June 1944, when Allied troops went ashore in Normandy, the United States and Britain had manufactured enough penicillin to supply entire armies. The payoff of a crash program that turned a laboratory curiosity into millions of therapeutic doses delivered in months rather than years. And by 1945, American production reached into the trillions of units per year, making staphylococcal and streptococcal wound infections survivable in a way they had not been a generation earlier. In the blood chain, a parallel revolution had already moved from experiment to doctrine. By late 1940, large-scale processing of plasma for shipment had begun, and within the next years the Red Cross and military programs refined the packing, storage, and delivery of plasma so that a medic could spike a bottle and restore circulating volume within minutes of hemorrhage miles from a surgical table, with hundreds of thousands of liters ultimately moving through the system to field hospitals, fleet hospitals, and transport aircraft. The nurses taken from captured field hospitals in Italy and the remnants of North Africa were not naive about science, and they were not unskilled. Many had worked under severe fire and had kept men alive with good nursing alone. What surprised them at Camp Florence was not a single miracle drug, but the logistics that put everything within reach. The first patient they followed was a 20-year-old infantry private from a labor detachment who had fallen from a truck bed and taken a bad blow to his chest. The American orderly rolled a portable X-ray machine to the bedside, plugged it into a wall outlet, and within minutes an image plate showed a clean rib fracture with no pneumothorax. The film went up on a light box, and there was no guesswork. In the German clearing stations the nurses had known. X-rays existed, but were stationary and often down, their tubes burned out, their generators short of fuel, their film rationed 2 cases already headed for surgery. Here, a technician made a picture at the cot, entered a time and case number on a card, and handed the nurse a breathing regimen and a plan for analgesia that did not depend on luck. The second patient they watched was a lacerated forearm that had gone 24 hours without proper debridement. The American surgical officer ordered irrigation, excision, and penicillin by routine. An order written in shorthand the nurses had never used. 20,000 units every 3 hours. Then taper and a second line for plasma. If systolic pressure dipped, they understood debridement. They had done it by lantern light on wooden tables. What they had not seen was an antibiotic schedule that was assumed and stocked, not argued and hoarded. The American system that produced those routines did not begin at the ward door. It began in factories. In 1943, American penicillin output was measured in tens of billions of units. By 1944, it had leapt to well over 1 trillion. And by 1945, many trillions, a growth achieved by moving from shallow flasks to deep tank fermentation, raising yields from single digits to most of the available substrate. In practice, that meant the drug was no longer reserved for the rare septicemia that might be saved. It was added to postoperative orders as a matter of course, a prophylaxis that bent lines on morbidity charts. The German nurses had been taught to think of sulfur as a scarce shield worth saving for abdominal contamination and compound fractures. They had been told that penicillin existed, and a few had seen it used in university clinics with samples routed through neutral countries. But they had never been told to expect it, on a cart, in a prisoner camp. Plasma told the same story, in a different idiom. In the first winter of the war, the problem had been obvious everywhere. Men bled out before they could see a surgeon, and whole blood could not be moved without a donor standing at the cot. The American answer, informed by research that turned blood into fractions and found that plasma traveled better than red cells, and did enough to carry a shock, patient to surgery, was to bottle the light part and standardize the kit. The case that convinced one of the German nurses was a guard with a farm accident, a crush injury from a loading ramp that tore skin and muscle and drained his color to gray in minutes. The American medic checked blood pressure with a cuff, took a pulse, and hung a liter bottle of plasma that had been boxed, labeled, and stored according to a scheme that put expiration dates and lot numbers in the same language as ammunition. The cuff pressure rose 20 points in 10 minutes, the man's hands warmed, and the room moved on to the next problem. In their own service, the nurses knew there were superb surgeons and clever improvisers. They had seen field transfusions done with direct arm-to-arm methods and gravity rigs. But here the bottle was part of doctrine, and doctrine meant predictability. Portable X-ray made the chain tighter still. Radiography inside German mobile units existed, but scarcity and power limitations made it intermittent and selective. And repair parts were a bureaucratic journey through a system unraveling under bombing. In the American station hospital the nurses walked through. A technician could shoot 6 plates in an hour and have 3 read on a light box before the hour was out. A tempo made possible by standardized sets, generator, tube, stand, film, developer, viewer. Each with a stock number and a shelf in a supply room that looked like an engine factory's tool crib. The effect on triage was practical. Fractures were immobilized correctly the first time. Shrapnel trajectories were charted before incision, and chest injuries were watched for air leaks with films that tracked a lung edge over days. Scale translated into time saved at the patient's side. The women's reactions were not all awe. There was bitterness, too, that what was routine here had been a rumor for them. They had spent the winter of 1943 cutting dressings from sheets and sterilizing needles in kettles, and they had learned to make do. Now they watched a ward nurse roll a cart stacked with new dressings sealed in paper, open one with sterile technique, and discard the wrappers without a thought to salvage. That offended habits formed in scarcity, but it also threw a hard light onto war economies. The one that could deliver packaged sterility to a desert camp, and the one that could not keep consistent power in a city hospital under bombardment. The ethics of care inside the fence were complicated and real. American doctrine required decent treatment of prisoners, including medical care equivalent to that given to the guard force. And in practice, the prisoner wards received the drugs and the films, and, when indicated, the surgeries. That equality of means did not make everything equal. African-American nurses, who had trained and earned their bars, and were still constrained by segregation in the Army Nurse Corps, were disproportionately assigned to prisoner camps, a decision the nurses saw with their own eyes, as black professionals managed wards, serving the same enemy that had bombed London and burned villages on the east, and were sometimes treated with open disrespect by prisoners who held on to racial hierarchies that the American institution had not fully rejected itself. The captured German nurses were forced to reckon with that contradiction, a system that could mass-produce mercy and still ration dignity at home. In the operating tent behind the infirmary, the clearest proof that the system worked came not in words but in tally marks. The surgeon posted a board with 2 numbers, cases opened and cases transferred. The aim was to do what could be done close to the patient, and move the rest to fixed hospitals by rail or air within defined windows. A discipline learned the hard way in North Africa and Sicily, and perfected by 1944. Evacuation hospitals, nominally 750 to 1,000 bed mobile units, worked to a tempo measured in hours, from admission to knife to transport, and the X-ray stand and the plasma rack had turned those hours into predictable segments. If the wound was clean, debridement plus antibiotics and immobilization would send the man out in a day. If it was dirty or deep, antibiotics bought time for transport and definitive repair. The nurses knew that antiseptics and sulfur had always been part of the kit. Now they saw that adding penicillin at scale was not a flourish, but the hinge that separated last year's mortality from this year's. Numbers made that plain. In 1943, a serious soft tissue infection, after a gunshot or fragment wound, could still cost a limb or a life at dismaying rates. By late 1944, when penicillin could be started within hours and continued by clockwork, amputation rates and postoperative sepsis in comparable cases dropped sharply in American series, enough to change the capacity planning of convalescent wards. Records vary by unit and theater, and not every outcome line is clean. But contemporary medical department summaries are unambiguous about direction. Infections that had defined surgery in the previous war became complications rather than fates, when antibiotic coverage and debridement were routine. On a ward tour, a week into their internment, 2 of the German nurses were assigned observational duties under supervision, not to treat Americans, but to help with basic care for prisoner patients. They received a brief on the Geneva Convention's rules for medical personnel held as prisoners. They could be retained to care for their own nationals and would be paid modestly, and they would work under the direction of the camp medical staff. The work gave them a privileged, if humbling, line of sight into process. A medic logged the arrival of supplies from a depot 3 states away. The ledger recorded lot numbers for penicillin and plasma, and the maintenance check for the X-ray transformer. That paper trail, taken for granted by everyone in the room, was the infrastructure behind the miracles. In conversations after lights out, the nurses compared what they had seen with the last months before capture. In Italy, their unit had moved 3 times in 4 weeks, fleeing artillery and short on petrol. They had known surgeons who could work for 18 hours and save men who should have died, but they had also watched wounds sour and kill, for lack of the right drugs in the right hour. Here, when the right hour came, the drugs were already on the shelf. The American camp did not make a fetish of novelty. It made a discipline of standardization. That discipline reached beyond the perimeter. Penicillin had not appeared because a single hospital willed it. It arrived because government labs, universities, and 20-plus companies had taken a British insight and made it a managed crop in tanks the size of garages, driving yields up by factors that made cost per dose fall fast enough to turn guidelines into orders. Plasma had not become a field tool because one surgeon preferred it. It prevailed because a national donor drive, bottles, stoppers, sterilization, shipping, and depot storage had been specified and audited, so that a bottle pulled from a crate in Arizona had the same markings as one in Normandy. Portable X-ray was not a luxury. It was an issued set, and sets have spare parts. The effect on morale was subtle. For a nurse used to making do, the knowledge that the next bottle would arrive when the present one ran out produced a kind of quiet confidence that was not bravado. The work did not become easy pain, remained pain, and loss remained loss, but it became tractable, and tractable is the difference between collapse and endurance. When casualty flows spike, the captured women learned quickly to keep their skepticism. They knew that the presence of penicillin did not erase the need for meticulous wound toilet. That plasma did not replace the oxygen-carrying power of red cells, that an X-ray could mislead if taken at the wrong angle. They watched American teams make mistakes and then correct them in post-op meetings that were short, blunt, and supported by numbers. A surgeon opened a case that should have been evacuated and said so in front of the team. The schedule for imaging changed by the next morning to prevent a repeat. The rate of learning was not only personal, it was institutional. Fast because every process had a place to be written down and then revised. In letters screened by censors, the nurses tried to describe what they were seeing without naming names or places. They wrote about a cart that always carried what it was supposed to carry, about a label that meant the same thing every time, about a lamp that turned on because power stayed on, about a dose given on time because shifts were staggered to make it so. They did not romanticize their captors. They were prisoners, and they knew it with every counted step. But they could not deny outcomes. Infections that would have filled a ward in Naples shrank to small clusters that resolved with drains and antibiotics. Men who would have remained ashen for days after hemorrhage brightened after a liter of plasma and careful watch for delayed bleeding. Fractures immobilized under X-ray guidance healed straighter and faster than those set by guess. Toward the end of that January, the train left the siding with a dozen prisoner patients whose cases had reached the point where definitive surgery in a fixed hospital was indicated. The captured nurses helped pack them for transport, checked that their penicillin schedules were written out through the next 48 hours, and that each carried a card with wound classification, last dose time, and imaging summary. That card, their American supervisor explained, was a passport through the system. It allowed the next team to pick up without asking basic questions and to fight the right battle rather than the last one. It was an unglamorous artifact, a rectangle of cardboard covered in handwriting. But it was the visible form of a principle they had come to understand in an army-scale medical service. The single patient is saved by the reliability of thousands of small objects and actions performed on time. The lesson bit deeper than professional pride or rivalry between services. It drew a picture of how war funds science, and how science, when disciplined by logistics, changes the fate of ordinary men. In private, their judgments were honest. Germany had its scientists and its institutes, and it had pioneered sulfamides and superb surgical schools. But by 1944, the country could not guard the transport lines that would have made penicillin common, nor keep electrical grids stable enough for field radiography to be routine, nor afford the donor network and bottles and trucks that made plasma a habit. The United States could, and did. The women could not know then how much of what they were learning would cross borders in peacetime, how quickly antibiotics would enter clinics in the ruined cities, how transplant technology would one day stand on logistics that felt familiar to them as they stood under a desert light. For the moment, the difference could be measured at a bedside, in degrees of fever that fell by the evening dose and pulses that slowed as liters ran. And for nurses who had learned their craft in scarcity, the greatest surprise of Camp Florence was not that American medicine had new tools. It was that those tools arrived not as exceptions but as expectations, the baseline of care rather than the miracle, the floor rather than the ceiling. And for anyone committed to keeping people alive, that was the most radical thing of all. They learned to watch the clock the way surgeons watched a bleeding edge, to feel the rhythm of a ward that treated time itself as an instrument. And by February, the routine had become a language they could read. A convoy arrived after a training accident, out on the ranges, and the intake team absorbed 12 casualties in half an hour, without raising their voices. Each patient a short chain of steps that repeated with small variations. Identify, examine, image if indicated. Start antibiotics if the wound crossed dirty ground. Restore volume if the pulse climbed. Immobilize and move. What struck the German nurses most was not speed for its own sake, but the way speed bought choices. In their own clearing stations, a bad fracture could devour a shift and trap a surgeon at one table. Here, a fracture passed through imaging, splinting, and decision in less time than it took to boil a kettle. And the surgeon's time was saved for cutting where cutting mattered. The portable X-ray stand, which at first looked like a clever convenience, revealed itself as a hinge in the entire flow, because it made diagnosis travel to the patient. With a working image, in minutes, a medic could see a foreign body's path and plan the incision short, a restraint that spared tissue and shortened recovery. And when a lung edge retreated from the chest wall between morning and afternoon films, the team did not guess about the need for a tube, they placed one. The effect of penicillin was less visible but more profound. In their notebooks, the women began to write down temperatures, morning and evening, white counts when they could get them, and wound notes after debridement, and the lines that used to slope upward into fever now bent downward by the second night. A schedule pinned above a bed 20,000 units at midnight, at 3, at 6, was not theatre. It was the difference between watching erythema creep and watching it fade. Records vary by unit and theater, and not every dose line translated into an uncomplicated course. But within weeks of steady observation, they had seen enough to accept what had sounded like claims on the far side of propaganda. When first whispered in Europe, antibiotics at scale changed the average case. Not just the exceptional one, and changed it in ways that were measurable by the hour. They asked about air evacuation because they kept hearing the drone of transport aircraft from the training field, and because the nurses, who rotated in from other posts, wore wings on their blouses. The story those women told extended the logic of bottle, cart, and stand into the sky. By 1944, air evacuation had become routine in multiple theaters. A practice that moved the wounded, not by days on bad roads, but by hours in a pressurized path of care, where a flight nurse was both clinician and contingency planner. The numbers mattered. Hundreds of thousands of patients moved by air in the European and Pacific theaters. Well over 1 million across the war's length, when all routes were counted. And in-flight mortality that instructors described as measured in single digits per 10,000. A safety achieved by selecting the right patients, securing airways, and carrying the same plasma and antibiotics the women now took for granted on the ground. That, too, was logistics, exercising medicine. A plane lifted off with bottles that had lot numbers and expiration dates, with standardized splints and morphine syrettes arranged in a pattern a blind hand could find in turbulence, and with an X-ray report attached to a chart so the receiving surgeon could think while the propellers turned. The Germans had known evacuation by train and truck and ship. They had even heard of flights when weather and priorities allowed. But routine air evacuation demanded aircraft in numbers and fuel in volumes that could be spared only by a side that controlled skies and depots. And it demanded the predictability of supply that let a nurse promise a continuing dose at altitude. They did not romanticize the flights. Everyone they spoke to had a story of a rough landing or a sudden dip that sent instruments airborne. And the flight nurses described frostbitten fingers and long legs cramped beside litters. Yet the aggregate outcome was what counted. An aggregate outcome was where this system's confidence lived. On an evening round, a captured nurse paused at a bed where a prisoner from an infantry battalion lay with a draining wound in his thigh that would have taken weeks to quiet in the hospitals she had known. Here, the wound had been opened on day 1, irrigated, packed, imaged to rule out a deep fragment, and covered with a dressing schedule aligned with penicillin. By day 4, the smell was gone. By day 5, the fever curve had flattened, and by the end of the week, he moved to a different bay. The change did not feel like magic. It felt like a plan carried through by people who could count on the next ampule to exist. The more closely they watched, the more the edges of the system came into view. Power was constant because there were generators with maintenance schedules, and men trained to keep them within tolerances. Sterile packs were not improvised in corners because they arrived sealed and autoclaved at depots that documented each step. Even small things like thermometers had a place to be calibrated, and a log that captured when it had been done. Those practices did not abolish error. They made it visible and correctable. The nurses sat in on a morning conference where the previous day's mistakes were discussed in tones that were respectful but unsparing. A missed early dose of antibiotic because of a shift change led to a new rule that the outgoing nurse completed the next injection before sign-off. A failed X-ray exposure led to a check of the stand's grounding, and a note on the board to repeat exposures immediately, rather than postpone until afternoon. The point was not blame. It was the same discipline that ran through the stockroom, a belief that a name and a time attached to an action could be improved on the next iteration. They could not avoid comparing that habit with the culture they had known, where a single surgeon's authority settled practice in a tent, and where everything depended on improvisation that could not be taught quickly to the next team. They had admired that kind of genius when they were close to it. They now saw the vulnerability in systems that needed it every day. At the edges of the ward, the war's contradictions persisted. American officers insisted that prisoner patients were entitled to care equivalent to that of their captors. And the nurses saw that enforced when a medic was disciplined for delaying a dressing change because a work detail pressed him. Yet the architecture of the camp reminded them constantly that they were enemies. They were counted in and counted out, their letters paired by sensors. their movements within the hospital guided by an escort who did not forget his sidearm, and their pay as retained medical personnel was a fraction of the regular nurse's wage. They watched black nurses run a ward with mastery and still face off-duty restrictions that left them segregated at the camp cinema or barred from an off-post counter. Those women taught them practical tricks with a generosity that made the structural insult stand out sharper. And the captured nurses wrote about them in their notebooks with the same tone they used to describe a treatment protocol, as if to say the human system required adjustment as much as the technical one did. The Americans they worked beside were candid about what they had learned the hard way. In North Africa, litter times had been too long. Evacuation lines had tangled, and wounded men had fallen into administrative gaps that left them waiting. The chain had been shortened by reorganizing who owned an ambulance and who owned a bed, and by setting targets in hours instead of in stages. In Sicily and Italy, those targets had turned into reflex, then into doctrine in France. By late 1944, the time from wounding to surgeons' hands in many units was counted in single-digit hours, a number that meant much less if the wound festered afterward, but that mattered, because penicillin and regular dressing changes now limited that risk. In the previous war, entire wards had been devoted to gas, gangrene, and to osteomyelitis that chewed bone for months. Now those wards shrank, because a drug in a bottle and a set of sterile habits denied bacteria the conditions they needed to flourish. The nurses were careful to write that not all lines bent evenly. Frostbites swelled wards in the winter, and chest wounds still killed fast when they arrived late, and abdominal wounds could still turn against skill and drug both. But as March neared, they had seen enough to believe that a set of tools used consistently across thousands of beds could shift arithmetic at a scale surgeons and nurses could feel at the end of a shift. They asked for reading and were given a small pile of pamphlets and reprints prepared for training. One described the development of deep tank fermentation and how oxygenation and cornsteep liquor had raised yields from a few units per milliliter to figures that made the idea of routine dosing plausible. Another described the plasma program's early missteps, the decision to separate components for storage stability, and the defined limits that protected recipients from reactions by standardizing bottles and filters. A third was not medical at all, but a quartermaster summary that listed stock numbers for an imaging set and its spare parts, right down to fuses and packing shims. Together they were a syllabus for a view of medicine that joined bench to bed to ledger. A doctor they respected said it plainly at the end of a lecture. An antibiotic without a distribution plan is a story, not a treatment. The camp became a strange kind of school. Under the Geneva rules, the nurses could be used to care for prisoners, and their supervisors leaned into that, assigning them to shifts where they would see the system's full cycle. They started intravenous lines, changed dressings, recorded temperatures, delivered scheduled doses, and sat beside men who were frightened, stubborn, or in pain. The work was familiar and humbling, and it taught them the American habit of making notes legible to the next person rather than personal. They began to think in the lines of the chart rather than in the lines of memory. They learned to call for help soon rather than late, because the help came. And when equipment failed, they learned to pull a spare from a designated place rather than to work around the failure, and promised themselves they would find a fix later. Those seem like small differences. They were not small in practice. In April, their camp received an instruction to prepare a cadre for transfer, because prisoner medical personnel would be repatriated as the war in Europe moved toward its end. The nurses felt the wrench of leaving a place where they had learned so much and the pull of returning to a country that had become unrecognizable by rumor and letter. They packed the few things they owned and rolled up the notes they had been permitted to keep, stripped of names but full of steps. On their last evening shift, they stood a moment by the X-ray stand that had come to symbolize more than a machine, and by the shelf where the bottles of plasma were arrayed like patient glass soldiers waiting to be summoned, and they tried to draw a line from what they had seen to what they could carry. It would not be the equipment, it would be the doctrine of making a good result repeatable. After the surrender, they moved through a chain of transit camps and across the sea, and they returned to hospitals where light flickered and stockrooms were bare, where antibiotics were just beginning to filter into practice, and where the people who had survived wanted immediate miracles from a drug they had heard had saved enemies. The women resisted both despair and myth. They argued for sterility routines that could be sustained with the resources at hand, for dose schedules that matched what was in the cabinet today and tomorrow, for using imaging to answer the question whose answer would change the plan rather than to substitute for judgment. They spoke quietly, but with the interest of people who had seen a process work, because everybody owned a piece of it, and because the pieces fit. In time, the flow of supplies improved. Penicillin, that had been rarer than rumor, became a vial with a purchase order. Radiography units acquired power and parts. Blood programs rebuilt with whole blood, and later, with components that surpassed the wartime plasma model, even as they honored its central insight. That volume and timing saved lives. The nurses' stories became part of the whispered lore that traveled with a new generation of German doctors and nurses who were rebuilding, not just wards, but a professional ethic that prized transparency and standardization over hierarchy for its own sake. Years later, when military medicine reorganized once more, and when civilian hospitals embraced quality control as more than a slogan, the arc the women had traced in their desert winter felt less like a curiosity of captivity, and more like an early look at a future that would not belong to any flag. They had gone to war as professionals, and had been made prisoners. Inside the wire, they had met a system that treated penicillin, plasma, and portable radiography not as miracles but as tools governed by schedules and spares. And they had seen how that attitude turned single cases into trends that arced toward survival. The details stayed with them. The feel of a glass bottle warming in their hands as a pressure cuff squeezed a sleeve. The hum of a transformer before a plate exposed. The way a fever chart bent after a dose given on time. The habit of writing a time and a name next to an act, and holding oneself to both. Those were not American inventions. They were habits any service could adopt, if it chose to build the chain that supported them, and to accept the discipline that made the chain durable when the weather turned bad and the shells fell. The women had no taste for slogans by the time they had seen both sides' promises consumed by reality. But they kept one conviction that merged professional pride and human hope. In a war that specialized in breaking systems and people, they had spent months inside a ward where a plan held, where a sickness that would have killed a man in the last war could be turned aside by a bottle, a film, and a schedule, and where the worth of those things did not depend on uniform color. That memory did not erase the reasons they had been fighting, and it did not dilute the courage of the women who had worked without those tools, in ruined cities and tents, under fire. It simply testified to the power gained when a society decides that medicine is not an accessory to war, but one of its central logistics, to be supplied, measured, and improved, like food and fuel. The captured nurses carried that testimony home. And in the long, quiet years that followed, they could point, patient by patient, to the surprising truth they had learned with the desert wind in their hair and an escort at their shoulder, that the most radical gift a hospital can give is not a miracle, but a reliable next dose. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.